Reports came out on Friday suggesting that 2 teams have allegedly broken the 2021 cost cap. It looks like Aston Martin have made a minor breach of less than 5% and Red Bull Racing by over 5%. Now, none of this is confirmed yet, and the FIA have put this statement out, although we all know what happened last time. Speculative and conjecture were used in a statement. Otmar, certificates of compliance will be awarded to all the teams who have successfully kept it within the cost cap later next week. But regardless of whether this is true or not, it does bring up a fair conversation around what the ruling should be if teams exceed the cost cap. What should be the punishment? What happens next? We don't know. Obviously, this is way more controversial because it's Red Bull involved. The team who in 2021 pushed the championship right to the end and ended up winning. Could not operating within the cost cap last year affect the validity of that championship within the rules set out by the FIA? Maybe. Let's talk about it. Let's do a quick reminder of exactly what the cost cap is. It was introduced last year, limiting all teams to a $145 million a year expenditure. It's 140 this year, 135 in 2023, so it's gradually coming down. The aim, of course, is to bring the field closer together, giving the minnows a chance to fight against these teams that are so bloated historically, spending hundreds of millions. It also makes the sport a bit more appealing to anyone who wants to buy in, because you don't have to be spending 300, 400, 500 million to be competitive now, or at least the hope is in time that you won't. Because it's also important to remember it's a cap, not a minimum limit. So your Hasses, your Williams, your AlphaTauris are probably not spending 145, even though that is the cost cap at the moment. So they don't really have to change much because they're not at that limit. Although teams like Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull, they were spending way more than 145. So they've had to make loads of changes to get the companies down to that level. Now on paper, this all sounds great. Yet here we are, 10 months after the season finished last year, and finally the results of whether the teams operated within this cost cap last year appear to be in. Now your accounts need to be submitted by March 31st. So for 2021 you need to submit the accounts by March 31st, 2022. Failure to do so by this point is called a procedural breach. Now Williams have already fallen foul of this. They got fined $25,000 back in May for not meeting the March deadline. Apparently there were some issues towards March. Williams actually let the FIA know beforehand that they wouldn't be able to get him in on time. Why? I don't know, but 25k fine is what the FIA decided was the right punishment for that. That deadline was 7 months ago, so it's taken 7 months for this to all be analysed, right? Because you can't just take what the team has submitted on face value. You can't trust them to not try something. So obviously, rightly, Formula One have their own accountants who will look for everything and make sure everything adds up correctly, right? And again, I think it's important to remember that 2021 was the first year of the cost cap. So that also makes this the first time that those cost cap accounts are being verified and checked and looked into. And seemingly 8 out of the 10 teams are in the clear, which is actually more than I expected. I expected there to be more teams that would go over the cost cap, and maybe there will be more. Again, none of this is fully verified yet, but the speculation is very loud, and I'm sure there's a reason for that. And also it's important to say that even if it's not malicious, teams can end up going over the cost cap. I mean, accident damage costs teams millions, whether it's your driver crashing, whether you're getting caught up in a shunt that's completely outside of your control. Ultimately, that is motorsport. In motorsport, you have to pay for things that aren't your fault because crashes happen. But again, it's the same rules for everyone. The teams need to account for this. So it's 145. That's the cost cap. Take it or leave it. So now on to the punishment, or should I say punishments, because it is outlined in the official FIA documentation, which I will link in the description below so you can check it out yourself. What the punishments are for teams that exceed the cap. Kind of. Because instead of a hard and fast set of if you fail by this much, then you get this punishment, instead there's just kind of a lot of different potential outcomes that can happen, all at the discretion of the FIA. So again, seemingly, allegedly, it looks like Aston Martin have exceeded by less than 5%, which is $7.25 million. Anything less than 5% is defined as a minor breach of the regulations, which can be punished in any of the following ways: public reprimands, whatever that is. Maybe Lawrence Stroll's just going to be told he was very naughty and got to sit on the naughty step, which would actually be kind of funny to see. A deduction of constructors' championship points, and again, this is from the season where the cost cap was breached, so it will be 2021. And also a deduction of drivers' championship points. which of course is the more interesting one. There's also suspension from one or more stage of a competition excluding the race itself. So I imagine this could be, exclusion from FP1 or exclusion from qualifying maybe. There's limitations to conduct aerodynamic or other testing on the car. And finally, there's a reduction of their cost cap, which I'd imagine would be their next year cost cap. So looking ahead to 2023, I suppose. Now, further to this, when we're talking about the team, seemingly Aston Martin, that has had this minor breach, well, Toto Wolff was interviewed by Sky Sports earlier on, and he basically said that as far as he was aware, the team that had the minor failure was a procedural one, which is the same terminology that was used around the Williams fine, which tells me that Aston Martin will probably just get some sort of monetary fine for this. Which, look, I'm not being funny, I'm sure they would, that is the option that they would take, they would accept. Lawrence Stroll will be very happy with that because some of these potential punishments look pretty rough. So then we come on to the major breach, all right? The alleged Red Bull overspend by more than 5%, so more than $7.25 million. All we can take away from this is that, Aston Martin might have spent, $10 over the allowance, right? Whereas Red Bull have seemingly spent more than 7.25 million over, that's a lot. And the potential penalties are all of the ones previously outlined. Exclusion from the championship, which is obviously huge. Team and drivers, I would imagine. So look, as this is written in the rules, if they chose, could the FIA, within their rights, exclude Red Bull from the 2021 World Championship? Seemingly so. It actually could happen. Like, again, I've linked this document in the description below. Look at page 23, the bottom of page 23 and down. That's when you can see all the exclusions, right? Now, to me, when I first saw this, I did think it was a bit weird that the regulations didn't specifically tell you, again, like if you exceed it by this percent, then you get this punishment. But then I was kind of rightly told when I put this out there that, teams could look at that and strategize around it because, oh, look, we know we're going to get this punishment if we go this much over. So, okay, yeah, we can take that on the chin. It's still worth it. In the same way that you get engine penalties, right? Engine penalties are always taken strategically, okay? They're taken at tracks where they're going to benefit the most from a new power unit, or they're taken when they've already got other penalties to serve, then they'll just chuck the engine penalty on as well, and then they don't really miss out too much. So in hindsight, I think it probably is fair to not give a, hard, fast, written punishment necessarily, I suppose. Maybe in time, but maybe not right now. Okay, so now we all know what the rules actually are. Let's discuss, because I think in this instance, it's more interesting to talk about what we think the rules should be than argue around the semantics of, oh, well, I interpret the rules in this way, blah, blah, blah. It's about what we think, what we want the sport to be. And the cost cap is a huge part of Formula One now, and it's going to be for the rest of time. So we need to understand this and try and come up with some kind of solution that stops people from cheating, basically, without overextending as well, because I think the punishment has to fit the crime. Say you've got one team that goes 4.9% over the cost cap and another team that goes 5.1% over it. Do I think they deserve vastly different punishments? No. I mean, that 0.2% difference is a $290,000 difference, which that might sound a lot to you or me, but to a big company, that's not a huge amount of money. But if a team goes 20% over the cost cap, that's a $29 million overspend, which clearly deserves a much harsher penalty. But again, where do you draw the line? We don't know the exact figures yet, so we can only speculate. But again, let's just take Aston Martin and Red Bull out of this conversation point. This is about what the cost cap should be long term for everyone. How do we dissuade all teams from taking the mickey? I mean, yeah, sure, you can, maybe accidentally spend a little bit over. I can kind of understand that to an extent. But how do we give enough of a punishment to these teams who unfairly try and exploit the rules? Now, financial penalties, like we saw at Williams, the 25k, is not really going to do much, in my opinion, to dissuade, right? Especially if you can pay that fine outside of your cost cap allowance. A big multinational company like Mercedes, like Ferrari, like Red Bull, like McLaren, like Alpine, they can pay 25k like that. It's not a big deal to them. For a penalty to be a penalty, it needs to have an actual effect. If you did take that fine from the cost cap, then kind of makes more sense. That is essentially the same as reducing the cost cap because you're just fining that money away. And also reducing CFD aero time would kind of fall into this remit as well because you're taking away resource from the team to be able to invest down the line, whether that's money or whether that's time to put into your simulator or your wind tunnel. These could make a difference, and yes, sure, maybe if you've exceeded by 1-2%, I could probably get behind those kind of punishments, but for anything more than that, I don't think those kind of fines or taking away aero time is probably the right call. Now, disqualifying teams from sessions or even full races is also an interesting one. Again, it depends, which race a team's going to be able to strategically, okay, we know we're not going to be allowed to race in this race, so then we'll use that time to invest more in the factory so we don't have to fly to the other side of the world and we can maybe get a bit of a leg up on the next upgrade. Like, yeah, sure, that opportunity to score points is gone, but it's not a complete L. These F1 teams are very clever, and I don't know, I think taking away FP1 sessions or qualifying sessions, again, it's like, okay, well, we'll take that qualifying punishment on a track we know we can pass and get through to the front. We saw what Max Verstappen did in Belgium. So this one also, I'm not massively like, yeah, that's the solution. Now we get to the whole removal of points / exclusion from championship argument, which, isn't unheard of. In sport, we have seen teams, stripped of their winnings, whether it's, football teams or whether it's, we see it quite a bit in the Olympics with doping. Now, obviously, I know a lot of people have been calling for this one, particularly after what happened in Abu Dhabi last year. People feel that was illegitimate anyway, let alone if Red Bull also spent over the cost cap. The fact they were level on points going into that last round, the fact that Michael Massey's tomfoolery gave Max that advantage and Max seized it. My main issue with this one is that every time you would get to, you've won the championship, right? You know that in 10 months down the line, once these accounts have been checked, there's a chance you could lose it. And I don't know, I just think there needs to be a solution that means that every single championship, once it's finished, it's finished. A solution that does what it can to make sure the current championship is legitimate as it can be and punishes, but without going back and changing results. Because awarding championships, 10 months later, I don't really think anyone wins from that. You rob that driver who does win it in the end the opportunity to celebrate, and the dreams of the driver that, through no fault of their own, their team overspent, those are crushed. So I don't think that's the solution, but I do maybe in certain circumstances, and I think it all depends on how much the cap has been exceeded. Because the best punishment I've seen is around a sporting penalty, introducing a ballast of some kind. Now, ballast is weight that's essentially added to a car to slow it down, because the more weight, everything's slower. The acceleration is slower. Performance around corners is slower. Weight hurts everything. So if you introduce ballast as a punishment for exceeding the cost cap, I think that's a viable solution. There is going to be a large amount of time between submitting your financial reports and it all being checked and being ticked off. I don't know how quick that can happen. Maybe it will get quicker in time. But I do think once this cost cap generation, we start to work into it, okay, for any transgressions in 2021, use that and work out a percentage of ballast that's added to the car for 2023. You couldn't do it for 2022 because you've not done quickly enough. And I think a whole season of having to run ballast is a good punishment and a good dissuasion to stop, because teams would hate that. They'd want to avoid that at all costs. I mean, they're not even running full paint schemes in their cars to save a little bit of weight. Imagine adding a few kilos of ballast. The designers will not be happy. Now, is that system perfect? No. I mean, what's stopping a team spending like 3 times the cost cap, producing a worldie of a car, winning the Constructors, winning the Drivers' Championship, and then just being like, you know what, we'll take the 14 tons of ballast next season. Not even next season, the season after next. Take the L and move on from there. Okay, so maybe in that instance, when there's been a clear and obvious complete disregard of the rules, then maybe that means disqualification. I can get behind that. But again, where is that line? It's very difficult to say. I saw Toto Wolff speaking to Sky Sports F1 earlier, and he did make some very good points. And of course, Toto's coming from a position where, Mercedes don't seem to be in trouble, and obviously he's going to be standing up for the best interests of his team. But all of the teams have worked towards this cost cap. A lot of people have been laid off. The big teams especially have had to make a lot of changes, a lot of restructuring to get into this new cost cap generation. So I get his frustration if another team hasn't fully abided by these rules, especially if that team was the team that took the championship off you last year. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see, again, how much these teams, maybe Red Bull, maybe not, have overspent, and B, what the punishment is, because I think they do need to come down hard on this. But what do you think? That's the most important thing. Let me know in the comments down below. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.